Morgan Rogers became the second most expensive player in Premier League history and the most expensive British player ever after completing a move from Aston Villa to Chelsea for £117 million. Straight away after that, Alejandro Garnacho completed a move in the opposite direction, going from Chelsea to Villa on a loan with an obligation to buy term. This brought about the usual conversations we always have every summer, mirroring how Jarell Quansah went from Liverpool to Bayer Leverkusen shortly after Florian Wirtz went from Bayer Leverkusen to Liverpool for a record fee last summer. Football finances take a hold every summer with arguments about fairness, spending limits, and general dismay at the order of transfers. But we've been used to PSR, otherwise known as the profitability and sustainability rules of the Premier League. If you ask any Newcastle or Aston Villa fans, they'll tell you the exact rule set and laws in place, as it's been very controversial over the years for supposedly favouring the big six clubs. We also seen many stories such as Chelsea selling their own stadium to themselves in weird profitability techniques and huge amounts of buy sell patterns. Thus, from 26-27 season, we will see the new squad cost ratio and sustainability and systemic resilience systems put in place designed to improve footballing finances and transfers as a whole. Today, we're going to explore how that works and how clubs might utilise and find loopholes for the future. Just to remind everyone before we get into it, these rules only apply to Premier League clubs. So if you're looking at any UEFA or European transfers, they use a slightly different system, although the new SCR is designed to mirror UEFA's FFP. For those who don't recall how PSR worked, it essentially put a limit on how much you could lose year on year over a 3-year span. The total was £105 million, so basically, on average, you could lose £35 million over 3 years. It also featured the concept of amortization, which we will see in SCR still, which is essentially where you take a player's contract value and spread it throughout the years of their contract. So if you buy a player for £100 million on a 5-year deal, each year will be worth £20 million. SCR caps spending at 85% of total revenue. This is very, very similar to FFP's 70% cap, so all clubs in Europe will have to adhere to both rule sets. Now, revenues for football are split into 2 buckets. The first bucket is club revenues. This includes any commercial income, matchday income, but also net profits from events like concerts, NFL matches. I'm thinking about Tottenham Hotspur's stadium. The second bucket is league revenue. These are payments from the Premier League themselves, broadcast revenue, and of course prize money from winning competitions, winning the league, any tournaments. What we also account for is player sales, of course, when it comes to these revenues. Now, in terms of what's measured at the 85%, player wages, head coach wages, they're all accounted for as long as transfer fees, amortization, etc. But any background staff and assistant coaches aren't actually counted. Now, the first major difference between PSR and SCR is the measurement frequency. PSR retrospectively looked at these 3-year spans and reviewed them to see that clubs were complying. SCR will work on a year-by-year basis, taking each cap year start to finish, and is also measured throughout the year with a check going mid-season after the winter transfer window on March 1st and again in June. Now, prior to the season, the clubs and the league will agree on estimated revenue figures that the clubs can work off to balance their 85% cap. In March, clubs will present their expenditures against the estimated revenue. However, in June, it's against the official, actual accounted for revenue. So if you do exceed your 85%, it may not be noticed in March if your revenue expectation was higher than the actual reality. However, we know finances, there's always going to be wiggle rooms, and in this case, we have our green threshold and our red threshold. The green threshold is, of course, at the 85%, and the red threshold begins at 115, so that's a 30% increase on the 85. And how it works is if you are above the green but under the red, all you take is a fine, and importantly, no penalty points in the actual season. However, if you exceed the green threshold and are under the red threshold, your red threshold for next season shrinks by the amount you've exceeded it by. So if you overspend by 15%, your red threshold will lower down 15% the next season, capping it at 100%. So you can't continue to sit in this amber zone year on year on year. You need a few years of compliance, and every year that you sit below the 85, your red threshold will increase by 10%, maxing out at the 115. Exceeding the red threshold by any amount will result in a 6-point penalty and 1 point additional for every 6.5 million over the threshold you are. So you really don't want to be sitting there at all. However, I expect we'll see clubs going in a wave formation where they will exceed, and comply to sort of build up and down their red threshold year on year. It would almost be foolish to sit in the green threshold every single season when there'll be clubs that will be spending 100% and then 80 the next year. And just to mention SSR before we get into pros and cons, essentially this is just looking at solvency and liquidity of the clubs, which is very important. They have 3 different types of checks to make sure these clubs can survive more than anything. We're not going to touch on them too much because you're not going to hear really about these checks on the mainstream media. They don't hugely impact. They're just looking at cash in hand and making sure these clubs are safe and secure, which is a hugely important thing for survival, especially with new promoted teams and bankruptcy, and how tightly run these finances are these days. So what are the positives to the new system? Well, it allows more clarity regarding the revenue. Before the season starts, clubs have a much better idea of how much they're going to spend based on the agreed revenue estimates. It makes budgeting and wage structures much easier to manage, as you're not fearing for 3 years down the line an overspend is going to come back to bite you. It also fixes the problem of punishing clubs after the fact that they've broken the rules. For example, Everton were punished years after they'd actually broken the 3-year spend, and their squad was in a much worse state, and it could have been way more damaging. If you break the rules in that season, you'll get punished for that season. I think that's a much fairer system than we even see the Man City 115 charges. I know not all of them are financial based, but how they haven't been punished to this day due to courts. And if they were to be punished, you look at many of those players and thinking, well, you didn't play for the team when these rules were broken. It's not really fair on them. It also promotes growth of clubs outside of footballing related matters, as you can essentially increase your spending limit by investing in your stadium and your commercial revenue without actually feeling it in the expenditure. However, in the same sense, there's also many drawbacks. The large issue at hand is big clubs being able to spend way more than smaller ones. You look at teams trying to break into that threshold of Big Six and it's almost impossible, and not much will change, as the more revenue you generate with clubs like Chelsea, Tottenham, Arsenal, City, Liverpool and United are incomparable to those of Newcastle and Aston Villa. It could create a negative feedback loop, especially for the teams in Europe, with the European prize competition counting for your income, that clubs will consolidate their position in Europe, and you could see a negative feedback loop where the same teams are getting top 6 every single year. It also doesn't really solve the issue of commercial revenue influencing the squad, and we've seen controversial deals like Etihad for Man City and Newcastle's Saudi Arabian ownership deals. They still impact the spend limit, so you're not really circumventing that issue at all. I also think the precedent of setting the profit from non-football related events into spending caps will benefit teams like Tottenham, who host many things in their stadium, such as the NFL and concerts. I don't really see how relevant they are. I understand the idea of wanting to invest for growth of the club, but I do think things like a Taylor Swift concert shouldn't really directly impact your spending limit, more so things you're doing for the fans, the actual players of the club, building stadium facilities and supporting actual locality.